Thanks everybody for joining us for this Bug Bounty panel. Thanks to OWASP for having us here today to talk with all of you. A nice full crowd here. Thanks everybody. So my name is Sean Martin. I'm the editor-in-chief for ITSP Magazine. Our publication is all about covering the stories at the intersection of IT security and society. So I encourage you to look at some of the stories we capture there. And today, obviously, we're going to be talking about bug bounties. And as your moderator, I'll be looking at the panel here, which I'll introduce in a second. We're going to look at how bug bounties are run, some of the challenges companies might face, what incentivizes researchers, pros and cons of different types of models, and then we'll look at some attributes possibly of what types of companies would benefit from a bug bounty program. So quickly, just so I'm not here standing by myself talking forever, I'd like to introduce the panel because they're the experts on this topic. To my immediate left is Michael Gallagher from PayPal, Cassio Goldschmidt from Stroh's Friedberg, Sean Melia from Gotham
Digital Science.
Yep, Gotham Digital Science, sorry. And Mike Stoker from Baker McKenzie. So gentlemen, if you could please, just a brief introduction for yourself and your company so the folks know who they have with them today. I'll start with you, Michael.
So I'm Michael Gallagher. I'm the senior manager at PayPal. I manage all of the application operations type functions. So think penetration testing, bug bounty, all of our continuous production scanning, the application vulnerability lifecycle, and root cause analysis.
Cassio.
I'm Cassio Goldschmidt. I work for Stroh's Friedberg as a vice president in the proactive service part of the practice. And I help companies to actually get up to speed and create their bug bounty programs whenever they're ready.
I'm Sean Melia. I'm a senior security engineer at Gotham Digital Science, and I partake in a lot of bug bounties, mainly on the HackerOne platform, where I'm ranked one of the top hackers.
And I'm Mike Stoker. I'm a partner in the global law firm of Baker McKenzie. I work in the Chicago office, and I'm in the privacy and technology practice. So part of my practice is advising companies on things like bug bounty programs, data security breaches, and other related issues.
Perfect. So a nice round of different viewpoints here. So great conversation ahead of us. I was hoping for a few more people to get some interesting numbers here, but I'm curious just from the audience, who of you are familiar with bug bounties at this point? So everybody's pretty much familiar with them, so I don't have to go into too much detail, which is good. How many of you are actually running a program at your company? 2/5, roughly, nearly half. One might argue, we were having a conversation last night, one might argue most companies are probably running a bug bounty program, they just don't know it. It's just a matter of time before that researcher comes to them with a request for payment, right? And actually, I did some research preparing for this, and I reached out to a number of different folks and got some information back from, I'm not being paid for this, from HackerOne, BugCrowd, and Cobalt. And HackerOne actually pointed me to a stat that 94% of the Forbes 1000 actually have no vulnerability disclosure program defined. So ripe for some fun stuff to happen there. So let's get started. I'm not going to go into the definition of what a bug bounty is, but I think a couple more interesting points that might be worth calling out. So when do you think the first payout for a hack or a bug bounty was? Any ideas? 1800s, 1900s? Charles Alfred Hobbs actually cracked a physical lock back in 1851. I think he got paid 200 gold guineas, equivalent to $20,000 today for picking that lock, evidently. A couple more interesting things here. I guess everybody knows Facebook and Mozilla and Google and Microsoft all run bounties. I was going to share some stats. What I'll do instead of wasting time here, I'll actually post these as part of a recap that I'll do with this. Trying to think if there's another interesting thing here. In terms of payouts, what do you think one of the most interesting payouts might be? Nobody's going to guess, of course. So Slack, $1 million, that would be nice. Slack actually paid $12.50 for a bug where an emoji was described as being a cheeseburger and it was actually a hamburger or vice versa. So they chose to pay that bug submission $12.50, the cost of a hamburger or a cheeseburger, evidently. So, and one other interesting point before I get to the panel is we obviously see a lot of momentum in the traditional technical vulnerability research, community-driven bug bounties. But I read this morning, in fact, that Facebook is now extending that same model to their ad platform. And so now they're crowdsourcing the ads and communications on Facebook to look for ways or misuse and abuse of the platform in that way. So kind of interesting. So, gentlemen, we're on to you now, finally. I'd like to maybe briefly discuss the differences of the different types of bug bounties that there are, and maybe the value of some versus others, and where companies are having most success. So we're looking at closed versus open, public versus private, internal versus external. Let's see, public disclosure versus non-disclosure, and how that relates to hybrid pen testing as well, perhaps. So, Michael, I'll actually start with you. Your experience at PayPal, if you would, please.
Okay, so there's a lot there, obviously. So, start with...
Let's go with public-private.
Public-private. So, I would define public, there's a lot of different definitions. So, I would suggest that the difference between a public and a private is whether or not you want to allow someone to publicly disclose. And maybe even throw in, are you going to vet the individual researchers or not? So obviously there's pluses and minuses to both situations. So let's go with the vetting first. If you want to vet your researchers and make them almost applied to be part of your program, that's fantastic. You're going to have higher quality researchers, no doubt about it. The negative side to that is you're limiting your scope. So if somebody doesn't meet your requirements to get in and they find something, are you going to have an avenue for them to disclose? The secondary part of the public versus private, I would suggest, has to do whether or not you're going to allow them to go public when they have a finding. There are two key motivations, I think. There's certainly more than two, but there's two key motivations for researchers. One is fame, and the other is fortune. So are you going to pay them? A lot of people absolutely want payment for vulnerabilities. But the other piece of the puzzle, that fame. So a lot of people, PhD students would be a good example, very high-level hackers, they're actually more concerned about getting credit for that particular finding than they are the payment itself. And so if you restrict that and you say, well, you can be part of our program, but we're not going to allow you to disclose that, again, you're only going to get a subset of this whole research community. So those are those two big pieces of the puzzle.
I'm actually going to look to Sean, your perspective on that, maybe leading off of what Michael described.
So I would, when a company is about to start a bug bounty program, I always recommend starting private, doing a small pool of vetted researchers, HackerOne, BugCrowd, Synac. You can all go to them and they can recommend their top hackers for, say, it's a mobile application or infrastructure or web app. And you can start there, figure out how your internal company is going to be able to mitigate bugs, resolve them, figure out where your bottlenecks are, see if you need to hire on more internal people. So I always recommend starting private and small. Then once you figure out, you work through all those nuances, then you can expand either the scope, the researcher pool, or bounties, and then eventually go public if you want to do that.
Yeah, I would make an analogy with the adoption of static code analysis that a lot of companies actually have gone through. And whenever you start, you think you have already secure code in place and you are doing everything that you should, and then you run one of those tools and suddenly you find a bunch of vulnerabilities. Same thing happens with a bug bounty program. You think you're doing a good job, you think you're ready, but guess what? The number of vulnerabilities that you get can be overwhelming. And not only the true positives, but also the duplicates that you get. So having this structure also to be able to respond is really important. One of the things that the researchers, either private or public, they want to have is respect. So you should be on top of things. You should be properly staffed. You should be thinking about the consequences of opening up this thing. So starting with a private program is actually probably the better choice to start with a very narrow scope, So you can actually have a successful program. You can get good quality submissions, and then start expanding once this initial experiment is already in place.
And Mike, I know you get a lot of requests, maybe after the fact, of a researcher coming. What can you tell our folks listening here with respect to how to approach starting a program?
Well, I think one of the biggest risks when you start a program, it kind of touches upon what Cassio just said. When you start publicly and you're getting a lot of vulnerability reports in, there's going to be a question as to whether the company has the proper resources and procedures in place to vet, investigate, and remediate those vulnerabilities. And part of it comes down to a constructive knowledge issue, because even though the right people in the company may not know that those vulnerabilities exist, somewhere in the company now they've been reported, and that creates additional liability for the company if there is some malicious activity that takes advantage of that vulnerability and causes some harm to the company or third parties or customers. It can definitely increase liability for the company if you open it up publicly. So I think from a legal perspective, starting privately makes a lot of sense. And there's also an issue with respect to what Michael touched upon in connection with the private versus public programs and knowing the identity of your researchers. There will be many opportunities where you'll want to keep that vulnerability secret. And not only that, occasionally researchers do get access to, inadvertently, confidential information of the company. And at least knowing the identity of the researcher makes it much easier to enforce those confidentiality agreements that you might have in place with the individual.
So one could argue that the best way to keep those vulnerabilities secret is to not open it up anywhere and just hold everything internally. And I think traditionally that's where companies have invested, right? Do pen tests and whatnot. So maybe Michael, if you could maybe paint a picture for us of how a bug bounty program, either private or public, fits into an application security program overall.
So if you view your application security program as the secure product lifecycle, so you have all of these controls put in place up until the point where you get to live production level code. All that stuff would be obviously different. But once you've gone live and you have production code, there's a number of different techniques you can find to find vulnerabilities. So obviously continuous scanning. I believe the previous presenter talked a lot about dynamic scanning and some of the pros and cons. Obviously, you're only going to find certain classes of vulnerabilities. It's not going to be very effective for finding business logic type errors. The second, I think, most effective control would probably be a penetration test. So this would be time-boxed. It's usually limited in scope as far as it's either one person or three people or a small team performing that time-boxed test. That will be limited mainly by the time. So you're going to have a methodology and a scope, and you're going to allow these penetration testers to go as far as they can based upon those limitations. And then, the most effective control is really bug bounty. You now have the entire research community, all the time in the world. You're still going to probably have some pretty legitimate limitations. You're not going to want them to do scanning on your production code and certain things like that. But you will find a lot of effective vulnerabilities. So those three combined, I think, are a majority of the avenues. There's certainly some subsets and hybrids. I know SYNAC was already mentioned. They like to do time-boxed bug bounties, which would be another way of talking about a penetration test because it's time-boxed. So there's a lot of different hybrids.
And you didn't say the word scoping, but you kind of touched on it there. Maybe Cassio, if you can kind of define what scoping is and how important it is when defining a bug bounty.
Yeah, so that's something that all companies have to think about is what is open for bug bounty, right? If you have, for example, a new acquisition, you might not want to open. Some types of applications might not make a lot of sense to also open up for scope and let other researchers go and try to find vulnerabilities. One of the things about life cycle that Michael was talking, that I think it's pretty important too, is that as software becomes part of everything that we have and we do, the scope of what should be done in the life cycle is also expanding, right? Before we start seeing things such as Microsoft STL, which tells you, okay, there's architecture reviews, code reviews, testing, and you get up to a point where you have deployment, and there's very little about the end of life cycle of an application, as well as the possibility that an application will most likely be exploited. And when an application is exploited, there are a lot of things that come out after that, such as incident response and so on. So having a bug bounty program in place is becoming a trend. It's really becoming part of the development life cycle for every application. And I believe in the future, if companies don't have that in place, there will be consequences when they have litigations and other things going on.
So hopefully those decisions on what's in or out are defined by risk.
Yes.
But I'm going to look to Sean. What types of programs get you excited as a researcher, right? So what things that fall into scope excite you?
The bigger the scope, the better. More attack surface, more stuff for me to look at. Say everything's in scope, I can perform full recon, figure out their external footprint, or certain apps are in scope, I might focus on the bigger ones, because if you go after their core applications, the company's going to pay more for a bug. They might pay, say, $100 for cross-site scripting on one site, but like $2,000 on another one if it's their core main site. So bigger the scope, the better. You can invest a lot more time, see where a company has their assets. Are they global? Are they just in the US? It's always fun when you get a really big scope, because you can report a lot of bugs and make a lot of money.
Sean touched on global versus US. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that with respect to companies operating in the US versus globally, and how the legal risk changes by opening up things.
Well, I think some of that's really going to depend on the types of anti-hacking laws that you find in certain countries. I think the issue with scope, you mentioned having you like to have a larger scope. I think it's incredibly important for a company, if they do have a larger scope, to have a clearly defined scope. Because at least in the United States, we have laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and similar laws that will criminalize intentionally exceeding access to a protected computer. And what's a protected computer in the United States? It's really any computer affecting commerce, right? Which is any business computer. So if you have a poorly defined scope, you can waive certain rights to take legal action against someone who is engaging in malicious conduct. Or you can give that person a defense that, hey, this conduct that I engaged in, even though it was harmful, it was okay, you allowed me to do it. There are countries outside the United States that certainly have laws that are very similar. And if you don't have a clearly defined scope, you raise the same risk.
When we were talking last night, we touched on this idea of bringing that discussion through a law firm, such that the findings of the issues by the researchers are then communicated under client-attorney privilege.
Well, it wouldn't be the communications of the researcher that would be protected by attorney. So the issue here is, to the extent that the company discovers some vulnerability and it poses some risk to the company, how does the company communicate that internally and try to address it? And if it looks like it could be an issue that can raise the specter of litigation in any sense, it might be a good idea to involve in-house counsel in those communications to think about whether there are any of these internal company communications that you want to assert attorney-client privilege over that you would then not produce in the event of litigation against the company if it involved some sort of issue stemming out of that vulnerability.
Michael, I won't ask you to necessarily make a statement on whether or not you use counsel to manage this stuff, but what are some of the other parts of the organization that are involved in helping you organize and ensure that your bug bounty programs are